Global shutter, 120 frames per second, but at the expense of noise performance and dynamic range? And who really needs 120 frames per second? Well, turns out I actually do. So let me share with you now the good moments, the bad moments, and the surprising moments I've had with the A9 Mark III in the field trying to photograph birds and wildlife. When you first grab the A9 Mark III, you'll notice how much the ergonomics have improved. It lies very well in your hand and the wheels and buttons are easy to reach. And I also like that essentially all the buttons and wheels can now be customized in the menu, and even the exposure dial on the top right hand side of the camera can also be customized, and I turned that into my ISO dial. This is something, for instance, you can't do on the A1. And I love the rear flip out screen that lets you turn it in basically all directions. When you add the optional battery grip to it, it lies perfectly in your hands and feels like a complete camera. The A9 Mark III comes equipped with a 24 megapixel global shutter full frame sensor. That means all the pixels are read out at the same time, so we don't have to deal with any more rolling shutter effects like we have to do in most other mirrorless cameras. On top of that, we also have a fantastic blackout-free electronic viewfinder with a resolution of 9 million dot. So it's a real joy to use that in the field, and you have a very nice and clear picture, and having the blackout-free EVF also means that it's very easy to track fast action. One of the greatest new additions I've seen to a new camera body in a long time is the speed booster button in front of the A9 Mark III. This button allows us, while holding it down, to shoot bursts of up to 120 frames per second. And if you may feel like 120 frames per second or even 30 frames per second are too high for you, you could also set different frame rates in the menu. For instance, 5 frames per second as your base rate and then 20 frames per second as your speed booster button rate. Another crucial addition to the A9 Mark III is pre-capture, and Sony has done really well in how it's implemented in this camera. You can select anywhere from 0.01 to 1 second, and then the camera will record a loop of images for you when you half press the shutter button. And when you fully press the shutter button, the camera will save a certain sequence of these images onto your memory card as well. So you basically never miss the moment again in the field, even if you're a tiny bit too slow. I really love this feature on the camera, and it helped me tremendously in capturing all the action shots that you will see throughout this video. If you're using a lot of flash, then the A9 Mark III will also be very interesting for you because you can sync your flash at up to 1/80,000th of a second. A camera that shoots that fast and records so many frames per second definitely also needs a decent buffer size and fast memory cards to write all that data away out of the buffer. So the A9 Mark III comes equipped with 2 card slots that either take an SD card or CF Express Type A card. I've been using a few smaller size Sony Tough cards and also my ProGrade 480GB card, and that came in really handy because with a camera that records that many frames per second, you definitely also need fast cards, because at certain days when the action was really going off, I easily took like 10,000 images. Interestingly, the frames per second and how many images you can take before the buffer is full is the same for the SD card and the CF Express Type A cards. When it comes to the buffer itself, it's actually quite large and more than sufficient. However, if you're shooting at 120 frames per second, it's only about 1.6 seconds before you hit the buffer, or just under 200 files. But then if you lower that frame rate to 60 frames per second, you already have about 4 seconds to shoot. And at 30 frames per second, you can already shoot for about 13 seconds. So the buffer is definitely well sized. And for most normal applications, it's definitely more than large enough. The super high 120 frames per second are currently only available with a selected range of lenses you can see on the screen here, and third-party lenses are typically limited to just 15 frames per second on Sony bodies. The first time I was able to use the A9 Mark III was at an event that Sony invited me to in Sydney, and there we could use the camera with a variety of lenses in a lot of different situations shooting various kinds of sports. And while the camera really impressed me there and I had an awesome time with it, I still wasn't entirely sure how it would translate to my bird and nature photography. So when a few weeks later I got a big package from Sony including the A9 Mark III, the A1, the new 2.8 300mm lens, teleconverters, and their big f4 600mm lens, I was super keen to try it out in the field and see how all this amazing technology translates to my nature photography. And let me tell you, after only a few minutes of trying it out in my backyard, I realized how much fun I was going to have with it. With my R5, for instance, I normally get maybe 4 to 6 pictures before the bird has flown through my viewfinder and is out of my view. Whereas now with the A9 Mark III, I was suddenly getting like 50 frames of the same scene, which was totally incredible. Excited by these first tests, I set myself the challenge to capture some unique birds and flights and action shots in my backyard. So over the course of the next few days, I set up, dialed in all the camera settings, perfected my technique, and then within not too much time, I actually succeeded and got a few shots I was very, very happy with. It still takes a bit of skill, time and effort to get photos like this, but with the A9 Mark III was the first time that I felt like I could now capture these kind of images on a regular basis. And if you want to see how I set up my backyard and captured these unique flight shots with the A9 Mark III, make sure to check out the video that I linked for you down there in the description after watching this one. One thing this camera will do for you for sure is that you start to only want to capture birds in flight and action shots. Normally, I love a nice perch shot of a bird, but with this camera in my hand, I just wanted to take action shots. I was always looking for the next opportunity, like where's bird fighting, where's the bird taking off. So most of the time I actually ended up using quite high ISOs and shot relatively wide open in my lenses to be able to pounce on the next action scene whenever it appeared right in front of me. The autofocus on the A9 Mark III is excellent and it tracks these intense action moments with ease. Not every single photo in a series of files was sharp, but most of the images I got were very nice and sharp, and from every single scene I was capturing, I definitely had a large amount of razor sharp images to choose from. What's truly exceptional about the autofocus is its ability to jump onto a new subject, entering the frame out of nowhere with ease. With the A9 Mark III, if a bird came out of nowhere, I could just rip the camera around, start focusing, and most of the time I would actually find the bird and stick right onto it. So while the tracking in these action moments worked very well and initial focus acquisition in clean environments also worked very well, I was a little bit disappointed when trying to use the camera in more busy environments like birds hopping from branch to branch amongst different bushes. In these kind of situations in the mangroves, for instance, it was sometimes difficult to get the focus onto the bird or keep the focus onto the bird because it would often be distracted by leaves in front of the bird or next to the bird. Once the target was acquired, it tracked it very well and stuck onto it, but the initial subject recognition left me wanting more, especially in busier situations. I played around with many different autofocusing zones and autofocus settings, but in the end what worked for me the best was a small spot as my base autofocusing mode that I activated with the AEL button. And then on the AF on button, I had the wide area tracking where the camera finds a subject and then tracks it all over my viewfinder. And in most situations that worked very well. Of course, I set the subject recognition to birds when I was photographing birds and the autofocus to stay locked on to my subject. And in most situations that worked very well. Something not everyone might be aware of that if you go to the subject recognition menu and select birds, then in that menu you can again select some sub-settings of autofocus settings. So if you're using the camera and select these autofocus modes, make sure that you also check these sub-settings in the subject recognition menu. One test I always like to put all cameras through is shooting smaller birds against the ocean backdrop from a cliff top, because a lot of autofocusing systems get easily distracted by the waves. But the A9 Mark III performed very well in this scenario and most of the time were not distracted by the waves at all. Only when the bird got super small in the frame it started to struggle a bit, but that's totally to be expected. So when it comes to the autofocusing performance overall, it was very good and extremely good in certain situations. Only when it comes to shooting subject in busier environments, there were a few tweaks I would like to see made to the subject recognition, that it recognizes the bird easier and kind of knows that this stick isn't a bird and that I wanted to focus on this bird rather than on these leaves over here. One area where the A9 Mark III has surprised me a lot is the much improved IBIS and image stabilization in general. In the past, Sony used to be a little bit shaky when it came to the image stabilization. Handheld video was always a problem, especially with the longer lenses. While it's still not easy to do handheld video without the active image stabilization on, it's definitely a step in the right direction. We already talked about the buffer at the beginning of this video, and it's definitely an adequate size in the A9 Mark III, but at these super high frame rates, you sometimes wish you had a little bit more time to shoot, because you really have to time when your peak action moment is happening. If you accidentally hit the shutter button too early, you might be out of shots before the peak action is actually happening, because 1.6 seconds is not a very long time. So timing when you press the shutter button is definitely important when you're shooting in these super high frame rates. When it comes to getting great results from the i9 Mark III, it's important that you have a good image editing workflow and that you're confident when it comes to the image editing. And I would love to help you get amazing results with my masterclass, my pro sets, and my brush pack. With my pro sets, I allow you with just one click to transform your raw files, and in my masterclass, I teach you all the little tricks and steps you need to do in Photoshop to get amazing results from your own raw files. So if that's of interest to you and you want to become more confident when it comes to image editing, make sure to check this out down there in the description. Even the best cameras and crazy high frame rates won't help you if you're always that tiny fraction too slow and miss the moment. And this is where Sony has installed a great helper in the i9 Mark III, the pre-capture. So in most situations, I was able to capture the action even if I was a little bit too slow in my reaction time, which was fantastic. The only thing you have to be aware of when using the pre-capture mode is that it starts filling the buffer for you. So you don't want to set it to too high time. If you set it for 1 second and you're shooting at 120 frames per second, your buffer is basically full before you even press the shutter button, and that's not really what we want. You might have to play around a little bit, but I felt for myself the delay in reaction time I have is anywhere between 0.2 and 0.3 seconds, because I still got the takeoff even if I missed it, but I didn't get like 10 other photos of the bird still sitting on the perch, which would happen if you set it to too long time. And this is not images that we want, and so we don't want to pre-fill our buffer with unwanted images. We just want to have a little bit of a safety net when we're a bit slow in pressing the shutter button. Having the global shutter in the i9 Mark III also means that we don't have to deal with any rolling shutter effects in our images, and this is something I really appreciate. Oftentimes we don't realize we're dealing with rolling shutter until the moment we do, and then it's always too late. With many cameras, and especially if we're photographing larger birds that don't flap their wings very fast, we often don't notice that there's rolling shutter happening. Sometimes you might see a tree in the background that's a bit on an angle, but oftentimes it doesn't really ruin your photos. But if you're photographing smaller birds in flight, like hummingbirds for instance, or some of these smaller birds in my backyard, you will very quickly notice the effect of the rolling shutter in cameras that have a slower readout speed, and oftentimes this will ruin your images. So having the instant readout of the rolling shutter eliminates all of this from our images, and I loved seeing that. Encouraged by the great action shots I've been getting with the i9 Mark III and the 600mm prime lens, I wanted to put the camera and the new lens through an even greater challenge, capturing tiny blue azure kingfishers in full flight zipping past me. And for that I chose to use the new 2.8 300mm lens with the 2x teleconverter. And this was actually the first time I felt slightly challenged by the 24 megapixels of the i9 Mark III. I wanted to use the 2.8 300mm lens with the 2x teleconverter because it's so much easier to handhold and follow the bird and actually find the bird in the viewfinder. But at the same time, I was expecting that these tiny blue birds would probably be a little bit too small in my viewfinder, and I would have to crop the final images more than I would usually want to. But at the same time, I didn't really have any other options because the 600mm prime lens with the 1.4 extender would have been better for me to fill the frame with the bird. But at the same time, it's basically impossible to find a fast flying bird at very short distances with a long lens and a big teleconverter attached to it. So my choice in the end was the i9 Mark III with the 2x teleconverter on the 2.8 300mm lens, but I had a little bit of a concern whether I would be able to get the images large enough in my frame without having to do much cropping. What followed was an incredibly fun but also super frustrating afternoon. The first few times I heard the bird nearby, saw it fly past me, and missed the shot because it was so hard to actually find it quick enough in the viewfinder when it just comes out of nowhere, zips past you, and then disappears into nowhere again. But after having a few frustrating moments where I just simply couldn't find the bird in the viewfinder, I got dialed into what they were doing a little bit more and ended up with a few sequences where I actually managed to find it in the viewfinder and then also keep it in the viewfinder. And this is where the autofocus of the i9 Mark III impressed me the most. These kingfishers were coming at high speed out of nowhere, and if I managed to find it in the viewfinder and keep it in the viewfinder, all I had to do was press the AF on button and the camera would usually manage to latch on to the bird, and that was something I found very impressive. What I found amazing to see is how these birds actually fly when you're photographing them at 120 frames per second. Normally when you see the kingfisher, you just feel like they're flying past you with the wings flapping up and down. But now looking through these series of images, you see that they actually flap their wings a few times, then put them straight onto your body, kind of dart through the air, and then flip their wings again. So this is another moment where I realized that something is happening in nature that I can't even see with my bare eyes or with cameras that are not shooting at 120 frames per second. The biggest downside of using the A9 Mark III here was that while I was getting many shots, most of the time the birds were actually a little bit too far away, and because I was shooting with a 24 megapixel camera, I knew that I wouldn't have enough scope to crop in to make these images into usable images. And in these situations, I definitely wished I would have had a camera with like 50 megapixels. I got the same feelings when the kingfisher actually perched right in front of me. I was maybe 10 meters away from it, but with just 600 millimeters and 24 megapixels, I felt like there's just not enough scope in this image to crop in enough to the point where I would actually like to see it. And having a higher megapixel camera in this situation would have definitely been helpful. So in the end, I got some incredible images I only managed because I was using the A9 Mark III, but at the same time, I was a little bit conflicted because I felt like I was also missing out on a few opportunities because I was limited by the 24 megapixels of the camera. I also wanted to share a spectacular series of images with you that a friend of mine from Melbourne captured, Duncan Gronewald. And the one time he managed to acquire the focus on the swallow, and it's basically flying directly at him, suddenly does a crazy turn mid-air and eats that fly mid-air. So you can see with the A9 Mark III, you can definitely take some insane action shots. And this will definitely be the kind of photos that you will also be looking for whenever you have this camera in your hand. A lot has been said about the A9 Mark III when it comes to image quality, dynamic range performance, and noise performance. And I was definitely skeptical at first when I got the camera, especially because the base ISO of the camera is also 250 instead of 100. But then again, if you're shooting a lot of sports and action photography or birds in flight like I did, you'll hardly ever use that lower end of the ISO range anyways. And at the higher range, at like ISO 1600 or 3200, the ISO performance was still decent. The files are definitely a little bit noisier than with other cameras, but you could still contain the noise quite well in most situations, and it cleaned up fairly well with programs like Adobe Enhance or Dix or PureRAW 4. So overall, the image quality was fairly good and I didn't have any major concerns there, but at the same time you have to realize that there's very little scope in these images when it comes to cropping or brightening underexposed images. Like this image of the kingfisher flying in the rain. I really like it, but it was very hard for me to balance the dark areas of the bird against that bright background, and I ended up underexposing some areas on the wing in particular. And when I pull these up and run some noise reduction on it, there's hardly any details left in these. Now this will happen with most 24 megapixel cameras, but it's definitely one area where I felt like I was quite limited. So while the image quality was definitely outstanding in good light, there were some limitations when it comes to using the camera in lower light with high ISO when you want to crop, and especially also when you want to lift underexposed images. Here's an example where it worked quite well though. These pale-headed rosellas are very hard to photograph because they have quite dark areas and then they have these very bright areas on the top of the head. And in this case, I was able to lift some of the darker areas on the bird, lift the background a bit, but also maintain the detail in the bird's head. So while the A9 Mark III might not be an image quality monster, I think the image quality overall is very good. And if you keep an eye on your exposure and don't underexpose your subjects a lot or crop a lot, you definitely get amazing files out of this camera. When it comes to video work, the A9 Mark III actually has a lot of amazing features, and the S-Log files I got out of the camera looked also very nice and were quite nice to edit. I also really enjoyed the well-working wide area autofocusing mode in video mode, so the camera would just find the subject all over the viewfinder and then track it by itself in video mode. Having no rolling shutter means that we don't have any bending trees or bending light poles or any other rolling shutter effects in our videos, which is great. It's also great to see dedicated photo, video and S&Q switch at the top of the camera, even though I found sometimes it's a little bit too loose and you accidentally switch from photo straight into S&Q mode instead of staying on video in the middle. One thing I hope Sony will address with a firmware update in the future is that you cannot have separate autofocusing modes or zones for photo and video. So whenever I switch from photo mode into video mode, whichever autofocusing mode and zone I've selected in photo mode, I also have selected in video mode. Now there's a few workarounds. You could use a custom mode, for instance, or what I did is that I went into the menu and I unticked all the different zones and autofocusing modes that I didn't want to use. So I was only left with 2 or 3 options. And then I assigned one of the top custom buttons to toggle between the different autofocusing zones. Now this is a relatively quick workaround, but I would wish that Sony would just remember in video mode I want to use a wide area, and in photo mode I want to use a different autofocusing mode. All the other settings you can tick in the menu to be remembered, but for some reason the autofocus is the one setting that the camera doesn't remember, and I really wish that will change. While I definitely like the video files coming out of the i9 III, one challenge was that if you're shooting in S-Log, the base ISO on this camera is 2000. So on bright days, you definitely had to use quite strong ND filters or crank up your shutter speed. The i9 Mark III has certainly changed how I view and approach nature photography forever. There's basically a whole new world of images out there to be captured. So while I'm not a Sony shooter, I'm definitely very tempted to add this camera to my bag. The major challenge for me with this camera body is definitely the 24 megapixels. I found myself in certain situations where I felt like I could have gotten a decent photo with 50 megapixels, but with the 24 megapixels, I just ended up with a too small file after cropping. When it comes to image editing, the files also give you a little bit less scope, especially when it comes to cropping or pulling up underexposed images. So in the end, we have to realize that this is a highly specialized peak action camera, and in that field, it totally excels and gives you opportunities that no other camera can do. I wouldn't necessarily choose the i9 Mark III as my main go-to everyday camera. In that case, I would probably prefer a camera like the i1 that has 50 megapixels and slightly better image quality, because I feel like on that everyday basis, this camera gives me a broader range of images to capture. But then when it comes to peak action, I would always choose the i9 Mark III because I can capture images that like an i1 or other cameras just simply cannot give me. So if you're after a camera that allows you to capture unique moments like an osprey with the claws out, a kingfisher just hitting the water, or a bird eating a fly mid-air, then this camera is definitely for you. If you're more of an all-round shooter, you want to do a bit of landscapes, a bit of bird photography, normal bird and flight photography, and you like to crop a bit, then there might be other cameras out there that are more suitable, like the A1. So what do you guys think about the i9 Mark III? Is it a little bit too limited, too expensive? Or is it the ultimate go-to wildlife camera now because it can capture these amazing action shots for you? Make sure to let me know in the comments, give me a thumbs up for the video, check out my channel membership, and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!